The most dangerous people in society aren't criminals. They're your well-meaning neighbors. Right now, as you're watching this video, millions of genuinely good people are making decisions that will destroy communities, create cycles of poverty, and undermine the very progress they're trying to achieve. And here's the terrifying part. They feel completely justified doing it. Welcome back to Mind Blown Daily, where we explore the counterintuitive truths that shape our world. Today, we're diving into one of the most uncomfortable realities of human nature: how good intentions, when combined with incomplete information and poor systems thinking, become a recipe for societal catastrophe. This isn't about malicious actors or corrupt politicians. This is about your kindergarten teacher, your local pastor, your environmentally conscious neighbor, and that friend who volunteers at the animal shelter. These are genuinely caring people who would never intentionally harm anyone. Yet collectively, their well-intentioned decisions have created some of the most persistent and damaging problems facing modern society. Consider this. Over the past 50 years, well-meaning Americans have consistently voted for what they believed were compassionate policies designed to help the poor, protect the environment, and create a more just society. The result? Urban decay that has affected over 10 million Americans, welfare systems that trap families in multi-generational poverty, and environmental regulations that have pushed manufacturing to countries with far worse pollution standards. The mathematician Garrett Hardin identified this phenomenon in 1968 when he described the tragedy of the commons, how individual rational choices, when multiplied across a population, can destroy the very resources everyone depends on. But Hardin was looking at grazing land and fishing rights. What he didn't fully explore was how this same dynamic plays out when good people make moral decisions without understanding complex systems. Here's what makes this so insidious. Unlike obviously bad actors, good people have moral conviction on their side. When a corrupt politician makes a harmful decision, we can at least identify the problem and work to remove them. But when millions of genuinely caring citizens make harmful decisions while feeling morally superior, the damage becomes self-reinforcing. They double down, convinced that anyone opposing them must be heartless or evil. This creates what researchers call moral licensing, a psychological phenomenon, where people who see themselves as good become statistically 25 to 30% more likely to behave unethically afterward. They've built up moral credit in their own minds, so they feel justified in cutting corners or ignoring inconvenient facts. The Stanford prison experiment conducted by Philip Zimbardo in 1971 revealed something even more disturbing. Ordinary, psychologically healthy people will adopt destructive behaviors when given institutional power, even temporarily. The guards in the experiment weren't selected for cruelty. They were chosen specifically because they were normal, well-adjusted individuals. Yet within days, they were engaging in psychological torture. Now imagine this dynamic playing out not in a controlled experiment, but across entire political and social systems. Good people, convinced of their moral righteousness, wielding the power of democratic institutions, implementing policies that sound compassionate but create devastating unintended consequences. The scope of this problem is staggering, and understanding it might be the key to solving some of our most persistent social challenges. Let me tell you about Linda, a composite of thousands of real people I've encountered in my research. Linda is everything you'd want in a neighbor. She recycles religiously, donates to charity, votes in every election, and genuinely cares about making the world a better place. Last year, Linda voted for a ballot measure to raise the minimum wage in her city from $12 to $18 an hour. Her reasoning was simple and heartfelt. Everyone deserves a living wage. 6 months later, Linda couldn't understand why her favorite local restaurant closed down, why the small grocery store in her neighborhood laid off half its staff, and why the teenager next door couldn't find his first job anywhere in the city. Linda isn't stupid or malicious. She's suffering from what researchers call systems blindness, the inability to see how individual actions create ripple effects throughout complex systems. This cognitive limitation affects an estimated 85% of the population, according to systems thinking expert Peter Singa. Linda sees the immediate visible effect she wants: higher wages for workers. But she can't see the invisible effects: businesses relocating to neighboring cities, automation replacing entry-level jobs, and small employers simply closing rather than operating at a loss. This system's blindness becomes exponentially more dangerous when it's combined with moral certainty. Linda doesn't just think raising the minimum wage is economically sound. She believes it's morally imperative. This transforms a policy disagreement into a moral crusade, making her immune to contradictory evidence and hostile to anyone who questions her approach. The phenomenon extends far beyond economic policy. Consider the environmental movement's campaign against nuclear power in the 1970s and 80s. Well-meaning activists, genuinely concerned about radiation risks and nuclear waste, successfully shut down dozens of nuclear power plants and prevented the construction of hundreds more. Their intentions were pure: protect public health and the environment. The result? America became more dependent on coal and natural gas, contributing significantly more to climate change than if we had continued building nuclear plants. According to NASA climate scientist James Hansen, if the U.S. had continued its nuclear build-out at 1970s rates, we could have eliminated fossil fuel electricity generation entirely by 2000. Instead, those canceled nuclear plants were replaced primarily by coal, which has released millions more tons of radiation into the atmosphere than nuclear power ever would have, along with the carbon emissions that activists now desperately want to reduce. But here's where it gets really fascinating. When presented with this data, many of these same environmental activists don't change their position. Instead, they engage in what psychologists call motivated reasoning, selectively interpreting information to support their predetermined conclusion. They'll argue that renewables could have filled the gap, ignore the timeline realities, or shift the conversation to nuclear waste storage. Their moral identity has become so tied to being anti-nuclear that accepting the evidence would require a fundamental reconstruction of their self-image. This isn't unique to environmentalists or Linda with her minimum wage vote. It's a universal human tendency that becomes weaponized when combined with democratic institutions. Unlike markets, which provide relatively fast feedback through prices and profits, political systems can perpetuate failed policies for decades because the feedback loops are slow, indirect, and easily obscured by other factors. The urban renewal programs of the 1960s, supported by well-meaning citizens who wanted to improve conditions for the poor, demolished functional neighborhoods, and displaced hundreds of thousands of families. The war on drugs, launched with genuine intentions to protect communities from addiction and crime, has incarcerated millions of nonviolent offenders and destabilized entire communities. Welfare programs designed to provide a safety net have, in many cases, created multi-generational dependency by removing incentives for education, marriage, and employment. Each of these policies had widespread public support from people who genuinely wanted to help. The problem wasn't their intentions. It was their inability to think systematically about complex social problems. In 2009, researchers at Stanford University made a discovery that should terrify anyone who cares about ethical behavior in society. They found that people who had recently done something they considered morally good were significantly more likely to behave unethically immediately afterward. They called this phenomenon moral licensing, and the effect size is staggering, a 25 to 30% increase in unethical behavior following a moral act. Think about the implications for a moment. Every time someone votes for what they consider a compassionate policy, donates to charity, or takes a public stand on a social issue, they're actually becoming more likely to cut ethical corners in their next decision. It's as if moral behavior operates like a bank account in our minds. We make deposits of good deeds that we can later withdraw by behaving badly, all while maintaining our self-image as good people. But the Stanford study revealed something even more disturbing when applied to political behavior. People who simply express support for moral positions without actually doing anything showed the same licensing effect as those who took action. Merely voting for policies they considered compassionate gave people psychological permission to be less careful about the actual consequences of those policies. This helps explain one of the most puzzling aspects of modern politics: why the most vocal advocates for helping the poor often support policies that demonstrably harm poor communities. Take San Francisco, a city where voters consistently elect politicians promising to address homelessness and housing affordability through compassionate policies. Over the past 2 decades, San Francisco has spent over $3 billion on homelessness programs while the homeless population has increased by 38%. The median home price has risen from $4,000 trillion, over $1.3 million, pricing out the working class families the city claims to want to help. Yet voters continue to support the same approaches, often becoming hostile toward anyone who suggests their compassionate policies might be causing the problems they're trying to solve. The moral licensing effect explains this paradox. By voting for politicians who promise to help the homeless, residents feel they've demonstrated their compassion. This psychological reward makes them less likely to critically examine whether their chosen policies actually work. They've already proven to themselves that they're good people. Questioning the effectiveness of their approach would threaten that identity. Seattle provides another stark example. Voters approved a head tax on large employers in 2018, explicitly designed to fund homelessness services. The reasoning was morally clear. Successful businesses should pay to help those less fortunate. Amazon and other major employers immediately announced they would halt expansion plans in the city and consider relocating jobs elsewhere. Faced with the prospect of losing thousands of high-paying jobs and the tax revenue they generate, the city council repealed the tax just 1 month later. But rather than reconsidering their approach, many supporters simply blamed greedy corporations for not caring about homeless people. The moral licensing effect had made them immune to the system's level feedback that their policy was counterproductive. This pattern repeats across policy domains. Well-meaning voters support rent control to help tenants afford housing, then express shock when rental units are converted to condos or demolished entirely. They back environmental regulations that drive manufacturing overseas to countries with weaker environmental standards, then wonder why global emissions keep rising. They advocate for criminal justice reforms that reduce sentences, then can't understand why crime rates increase in their neighborhoods. In each case, the moral licensing effect kicks in. Having demonstrated their virtue by supporting the compassionate position, these voters become psychologically resistant to evidence that their approach isn't working. They've already paid their moral dues, so questioning their methods feels like an attack on their identity rather than a practical discussion about effectiveness. The phenomenon becomes even more dangerous when combined with social media echo chambers. Platforms like Facebook and Twitter are designed to show us content that confirms our existing beliefs, creating what researchers call confirmation bias feedback loops. People who have licensed themselves through moral voting see constant reinforcement that they're on the right side of issues, making them even more resistant to contradictory evidence. Consider how this played out during the COVID-19 pandemic. Many people who followed mask mandates and social distancing guidelines felt they had earned moral credit for being responsible citizens. This licensing effect made them more likely to ignore inconvenient evidence about policy effectiveness, dismiss concerns about economic or educational costs, and demonize anyone who questioned their preferred approaches as selfish or anti-science. The result was policy debates that became moral crusades, where questioning effectiveness was treated as moral heresy. Here's where the story takes its most chilling turn. Good people don't just create bad policies. They actively suppress the information society needs to correct those policies. This isn't the heavy-handed censorship of authoritarian regimes. It's the soft, suffocating censorship of moral righteousness. And it might be even more dangerous because it comes wrapped in the language of compassion and protection. In 2021, a group of Stanford medical students disrupted a lecture by Dr. Scott Atlas, a former Stanford faculty member who had served as a COVID-19 advisor to the Trump administration. The students weren't protesting because Atlas was presenting false information. They were protesting because they disagreed with his policy recommendations on lockdowns and school closures. Their justification was moral. Allowing Atlas to speak would cause harm to vulnerable communities. These students genuinely believed they were protecting people by preventing the free exchange of ideas. But their actions perfectly illustrate how good people become the enemies of progress. Science advances through hypothesis, experimentation, debate, and revision. When we prevent certain hypotheses from being discussed because they might lead to policies we find morally objectionable, we cripple society's ability to solve complex problems. The Stanford students weren't evil. They were terrified that questioning lockdown policies might cost lives, but their censorship efforts also prevented open discussion of the educational, economic, and mental health costs of those same policies. By shutting down debate, they made it impossible for society to weigh trade-offs and find optimal solutions. This pattern repeats across every contentious issue. Climate change activists work to suppress research on nuclear power and natural gas because they fear it will slow renewable energy adoption. Social justice advocates campaign to remove books and cancel speakers because they worry certain ideas will perpetuate inequality. Public health officials suppress discussion of policy costs because they believe focusing only on benefits will save more lives. In each case, well-meaning people use their moral authority to limit the information available for public decision-making. The consequences are catastrophic. Consider how censorship around urban policy debates has perpetuated failed approaches for over 50 years. When sociologist Daniel Patrick Moynihan published his 1965 report on the breakdown of African American families, he was vilified by civil rights activists who feared his findings would be used to blame victims of racism rather than address systemic inequalities. Moynihan's research showed that family structure was a crucial factor in economic mobility and that welfare policies were inadvertently incentivizing single parenthood in poor communities. His recommendations focused on reforming these policies to strengthen rather than undermine family formation. But instead of engaging with his research, activists launched a campaign to discredit it as racist. Universities stopped funding similar research. Policymakers became afraid to address family structure issues. The topic became effectively off-limits in polite society for decades. The result? The trends Moynihan identified in 1965 accelerated dramatically. Single parenthood rates in African American communities rose from 25% to over 70%. Poverty rates remained stubbornly high despite trillions of dollars in anti-poverty spending. Educational outcomes stagnated. Crime rates soared in many urban communities. By suppressing research and debate on family policy, well-meaning activists prevented society from developing effective solutions to the problems they most wanted to solve. The censorship was motivated by compassion, but it condemned millions of families to multi-generational poverty. Today we see the same dynamic playing out around discussions of education policy, criminal justice reform, immigration, and countless other issues. Good people work tirelessly to suppress research, silence speakers, and remove information they fear might be misused. They genuinely believe they're protecting vulnerable communities from harm, but they're actually preventing the open debate and experimentation that complex social problems require. The irony is devastating. The people most committed to social progress are often the biggest obstacles to achieving it. Their moral certainty makes them enemies of the intellectual humility and open inquiry that progress demands. They become convinced that they already know the right answers, so anyone questioning their approach must be motivated by malice rather than genuine concern for finding better solutions. Social media platforms have amplified this censorship dynamic exponentially. Content moderation policies, often designed by well-meaning employees who want to prevent harm, systematically suppress heterodox viewpoints on controversial topics. The algorithms that govern what billions of people see are programmed with the moral intuitions of their creators, effectively scaling individual censorship preferences across entire societies. The people making these decisions aren't mustache-twirling villains. They're idealistic young professionals who genuinely want to make the world better. But their efforts to curate information and suppress harmful content are systematically undermining the democratic processes and open debate that functional societies require. So, where does this leave us? If good people are the most dangerous threat to social progress, what hope do we have for solving complex problems? The answer isn't to become cynical or abandon moral reasoning. It's to develop what researchers call intellectual humility and systematic thinking skills. But first, we need to accept an uncomfortable truth. Being a good person doesn't automatically make you qualified to solve social problems. Compassion without competence is often more harmful than indifference. The path forward requires three fundamental shifts in how we approach complex social issues. First, we must separate our moral intuitions from our policy preferences. It's possible to care deeply about helping the poor while acknowledging that minimum wage increases might not be the most effective tool. You can be passionate about environmental protection while recognizing that nuclear power might be necessary to address climate change. Your values can guide your goals without dictating your methods. Second, we need to embrace what philosopher Karl Popper called fallibilism, the recognition that our current beliefs might be wrong, and that progress comes through constantly testing and revising our approaches. This means supporting policies with robust feedback mechanisms, sunset clauses, and built-in evaluation criteria. It means celebrating when we discover that our well-intentioned policies aren't working, because that discovery brings us closer to finding approaches that actually will. Third, we must resist the temptation to suppress information or silence debate, even when, especially when, we fear the information might be misused. Open societies solve problems through the messy, uncomfortable process of public debate, experimentation, and revision. When we short-circuit this process to protect people from harmful ideas, we guarantee that harmful policies will persist. The good news is that some communities and organizations are already modeling these approaches. Charter school movements emerged when educators acknowledged that traditional public schools weren't serving many students well, despite decades of good intentions and increased funding. Effective altruism advocates use rigorous measurement to identify which charitable interventions actually improve lives rather than just making donors feel good. Some cities are experimenting with participatory budgeting and randomized controlled trials for social programs. But these examples remain exceptions rather than the rule. Most political discourse still operates on the assumption that good intentions are sufficient, that questioning popular policies is morally suspect, and that complex social problems can be solved through moral passion rather than systematic analysis. Changing this dynamic requires each of us to examine our own susceptibility to moral licensing and systems blindness. The next time you vote for a policy because it feels compassionate, ask yourself, what are the potential unintended consequences? How will we measure whether this approach is actually working? What evidence would convince you to change your position? When you see information that challenges your preferred policies, resist the urge to dismiss it or suppress it. Instead, engage with it seriously. Use it to refine your approach or identify better alternatives. Remember that people who disagree with your methods might share your values. They might just have different theories about how to achieve them. Most importantly, recognize that being wrong about policy doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you human. The tragedy isn't that well-meaning people sometimes support ineffective policies. It's that our political culture makes it almost impossible to admit mistakes and change course. We've created a system where moral certainty is rewarded and intellectual humility is punished. The most dangerous people in society aren't evil. They're good people who are so convinced of their righteousness that they can't see the damage they're causing. But understanding this dynamic gives us the power to change it. By embracing humility, demanding evidence, and protecting open debate, we can transform our good intentions into effective action. The world doesn't need fewer people who care. It needs people who care enough to question whether their caring is actually helping. If this video has challenged your thinking about politics, society, or human nature, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We explore these kinds of counterintuitive truths every week here at Mind Blown Daily. And let me know in the comments, what's one policy you support that you're now wondering might have unintended consequences? That kind of intellectual courage is exactly what our society needs more of.